Okay, I think we can get started. Cool. So today, the structure of the class, just to go over it really briefly, we have a set of panelists. So there was a link set out for like questions that you guys could ask panelists, or you can like vote on those questions. And what we'll be doing is for the first half of class today, we'll kind of go through the questions that are commonly asked. Maybe we'll try to open it up. We'll take mostly questions from that link we set out, and then we'll probably open it up so that we can also take questions from the Zoom chat as well. So before we kind of jump into the questions, I'll have all the different panelists introduce themselves. So we'll kind of just go in, I'll try to do it in somewhat like alphabetical order, starting with Ajay.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Hi, my name is Ajay. I'm currently CTO of a company called Eruditus Emeritus. We offer online courses from top universities, and we make them affordable and accessible to people around the world. And prior to that, I ran engineering at Masterclass, which that one you might have heard of more because it's like online classes by famous people like Steph Curry and Gordon Ramsay. And then prior to that, I was running engineering at Piazza, which is an ed tech company. So I've kind of been in this education space for a while. And then I think my background that might be a little interesting to the group is, I grew up in Toronto, Canada, and, my parents got there because they were refugees from Africa. There's like a revolution in Uganda. And then I was very fortunate that, they ended up in a place like Toronto, which is social democracy and free education and free access to great teachers. And then obviously that helped me a lot in kind of my career into computer science and where I am now.
Cool, that's awesome. Well, thank you for taking the time to come by and answer the questions. I think moving on, the next panelist we have is Alex. Is Alex here?
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, great. I'm Alex Seville. I'm Director of Engineering at Flickr. It's a photo sharing website. And previous to some of that experience, I was working, Flickr used to be a part of Yahoo. So I worked there as well, which is obviously a very large company. And then previously, I'm also Canadian. I worked up in Canada at a variety of companies that were sort of, 10,000 employees all the way down to a startup that was 4 people. So kind of a bit of a range of startups and large corporations and things like banks, as well as just a wide variety of things like that.
Cool. And then I guess we'll move on to the next person, the next panelist, Justin.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. So my name's Justin. Previously, I'll start actually in the opposite order everyone else did. I'll go sequentially. Graduated college in 2015. Worked at a few different startups, then helped one of my friends from college start a global education company called Tembo. They educate kids 0 to 6 years old in third world countries via SMS. Went on to be the AVP of Information Security at Bank of America. Now I'm the technical co-founder and VP of Engineering at BotKeeper. We automate bookkeeping and accounting. Helped the company raise, to this point, $22.5 million. We've raised it from Google as well as Ignition Partners and a few other VC firms. So grew that company from 0 people to on the engineering side to about 27 people globally. So
cool. And then we'll move on to Mike. Mike.
Sure. Good morning. You guys hear me?
Yep.
Very good. What's up, guys? So brief history of me. I've been doing the internet stuff since about 92. Got into my career ostensibly has been in computer security mostly. Started doing it professionally around 95, back before there was much of a professional computer security industry. Most people from that era know me because I was Frac Magazine editor for a few years. If you don't know what that is, you can Google it. And so I'm pretty much a 90s hacking scene alumni, I guess. I had a career alongside that. Notably, I guess it's a lot of different boutique startups back in the mid to late 90s. Then I switched to Cisco for about 12 years. After Cisco, I went to a small cloud security startup based in San Mateo, California, named Farsight Security, run by Paul Vixie. Those of you in the internet engineering space may have heard of Paul. If you haven't, you should. Inducted in the Internet Hall of Fame. All around amazing guy. However, I left Farsight, startup of 50 people, about 4 months ago to join Salesforce, a company of 44,000 people as of a few days ago with a recent acquisition, where I'm a principal engineer on the threat intelligence team. So that's me.
Awesome. That's that's great. And then we'll move on to the last panelist, Terry.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Hi, my name's Terry. So I started my career in the quality assurance space. I spent, give or take, 12 years doing mostly consulting work. I also worked as a director of the performance engineering team at a consulting firm. And I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. So I quit and went to a boot camp to kind of take a break and learn the development side. I've been working as a dev since 2015. I started my dev jobs in the startup world. So I worked at 2 startups. And most recently, I have been working at Airbus. I'm a senior software engineer there.
Cool. Awesome. So before I guess we jump into questions, I'll just kind of have the panelists answer one question. So the question I just wanted you guys to answer, we'll kind of go around maybe in alphabetical order again, is like, what advice do you have for people who are maybe really early on in their career? So here we have like a lot of people in their undergrad, so advice maybe for like internships or like just starting off in your career. And I guess we can also kind of do it once again in alphabetical order. We'll start off with the J.
Sure. Maybe one piece of advice I'd give is, optimize for learning. This is maybe just from my personal experience. Whenever I've had to make a decision on where to go, where to live, what job to take, maybe one job pays more than another, I've generally optimized on the role that would make me learn the most. Kind of that growth mindset, like I found my job has basically changed every 3 years over the past 20 years. As long as I've optimized on learning, I found that I've been super happy in all the jobs I've had. I've been very fortunate, but then also it's been very fulfilling. The other one is, there's like a famous quote, not my quote, somebody else's, you can't choose your family, but you can choose your boss. I think that's like a very wise piece of advice. I think your manager or your boss has like such a huge impact on your career and where you end up. Sometimes early in your career, you don't have that much control. Like if you join Facebook, they just like, you go through the boot camp and you end up where you end up. But with a lot of startups, you can kind of see who they are. You can see on Twitter their personalities, you can see videos. And, at least for me, my career, I've basically just been pulled from job to job from that initial network that I've had, because especially the culture in Silicon Valley is typically, I found, very helpful. And actually, because of this unusual economic moment we're in, where there's a huge demand of software engineers, not just in America, but in the entire world, we're actually all fortunate that we're in a field that there's a huge supply of jobs. So those are maybe my 2 pieces of advice.
Yeah, that's great. I think I kind of started work 4 years ago, and that advice about managers is personally I've been through as well. If there's like a chance to pick your manager, definitely think about what matters to you. And then we'll move on to Alex.
Sure. So maybe my advice would be kind of in the interviewing realm, which is that I think sometimes people are especially if it's your first interview or an internship or something, people can go into interviews being extremely nervous and not necessarily knowing what to do. And there's certain companies that kind of optimize their interviewing process to make you uncomfortable a little bit, because it's like a little bit of a trial by fire kind of thing, where if you have the confidence to get through it, you're a good candidate for them. And so I would remind people that for most companies, when you come in as a candidate, they want to love you. They want to hire you. It can be a very difficult and time-consuming process. And so despite what some things may appear, the people really do want to like you. And so if they're being cold or something, you can kind of just not listen to that and be more like, what can I talk about my passions to show this person that I'm interested in this work, or this is what I'm interested in. And then similarly, kind of dovetailing off what AJ was talking about, it's an opportunity for you to interview the company also. And so you should really be thinking, as I'm going through these different interviews, which of these companies seems to align with like either my values or learning opportunities, like AJ was talking about, or if it's a smaller or bigger company, what does it seem like the company culture is like, or do they have a strong business plan, that sort of thing. So I think a lot of times people go into those and they're just trying to survive the interview and get out there, reordering a linked list or whatever kind of stuff. But you should also maybe, I'd recommend take some time to think about, if I was to get this job, what would be the things that would be important that, a year into the job, I wouldn't hate it anymore. What are the things that would like still inspire me? And try to bring those out in the interview, because that interviewers will also, that can also be a plus in an interview, because it shows that you're engaged and that you have some, interest in what you're going to be working on.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think having been an interviewer, I think seeing someone who's really passionate about what they do is always like a positive. Cool. So is moving on to the next person. Sorry, we're just kind of going through. Justin?
Yeah, I would say be open to basically anything. Like I took a lot of different career paths in a short amount of time. And like my buddy called me up, I was working at B of A, and he's like, hey man, I really need some help starting Tembo, but I don't have any money and I can't afford to pay you. And I was like, no problem, man. Like that's what friends are for. And literally grew that company. I think we had an engineering team of 30 or 40 people all over the world. And most of them were armies of interns. And I'm still friends with most of those interns, for, a few years later. And it's fun seeing them progress through their careers. And I was working full time at B of A at that time. So I was working, the 9 to 5, and then I would come home and work another, 7 or 8 hours, and it would be 2 a.m. and trying to align conference calls when you get people literally in every single time zone is quite difficult. But in while those were such stressful times, and literally I made no money from that endeavor, the friends and the connections I made, that's actually how I ended up at Forbes 30 under 30 back in 2016. So don't always go after the money. It's a unique opportunity right after college. Find some fun stuff and take some risks.
Yeah, great advice. And then we'll ask Mike. We'll have Mike.
Sure. Yeah, hey guys. So I actually was in an opportunity to recently speak to, I got invited to go speak at Notre Dame in Indiana, South Bend, Indiana, not in France, and talk to a bunch of graduating computer science students. And so I actually recently went through this whole process of, so what are lessons learned and such. So yeah, I can give you the boilerplate, fail early and often, take risks, be curious and all that. Yeah, that's important. But that's, you're going to hear that advice from a lot of people. So the specific things that I think are important. Number one, make friendships with like-minded ilk. People that you are, you find yourself constantly agreeing with, people that you look up to in terms of, for whatever reason, maybe their technical acumen, maybe it's maybe it's a softer skill, because it's not all technical acumen. That's obviously a big, large foundation upon which you build a lot of other things, but there's a lot of other meta skills that are important too. So keep those friendships, take them with you throughout your career, because 5 years, 10 years from now, these relationships you build are everything. People that I look back on that I've known for 20, 25 years, Alex Stamos, George Kurtz. Alex Stamos was CISO at Facebook until he stepped down. George Kurtz, CEO of CrowdStrike. These are all people that were, part of the hacking scene back in the 90s. And there's a laundry list of other folks too. So those are important. Take those friendships. Another quick one, find an area you're passionate about, specialize. Back in the day, you kind of had to be a jack of all trades, know all things, not just data structures and algorithms and programming, but you had to be, know the network stack as well. These days, it's hard to know all things. So be okay with picking a couple areas and specializing. And the corollary there is that abstraction is okay, right? So it's necessary these days. You cannot know all things. You cannot be, you cannot, there are very few people that know all things, that just you sit down and, you know, are comfortable with the Unix command line at the Windows PowerShell, know the 7 letters of the OSI model, and are intimately familiar with, you know, writing C code and Python and Java, everything. You can't know all things. So abstraction is okay, but be careful. Too much abstraction can get you in a little bit of trouble if you're too hand wavy with details. Example being, if you're going to interview for a job, let's say, oh, I don't know, in the computer security world. Those are the one example. You know, SRE is another one, site reliability engineer. These are jobs that require you to know a fair amount of underpinning fundamental technology. So abstraction's okay in some areas, but make sure that you have a solid understanding of the fundamentals. I think I've used too much time here, so sorry, guys.
No worries. I think that was really great. I think pretty unique advice, pretty specific to software engineering, which is awesome. And then we'll kind of end this question with Terry.
So if I think about what I would go back and say to myself coming out of college, I really struggled with confidence coming out of college, thinking that I could do software development. That's why I went into QA. It was easier. I feel like people still talk about it. It wasn't like, I don't think I heard the imposter syndrome word until like way after I graduated college. So I definitely had some version of just confidence issues. I think everyone suffers from that as you get older. One thing I did learn as I get older is like, nobody really knows what the hell they're doing a lot of the time. So try to not take yourself out of the game. Apply to the jobs that you want, not to the jobs that you think you can get. If you're interested in something, go after it. You may fail, but not trying kind of sucks when you look at it 10 years down the line. So that's one thing. The second thing that I would say is to never stop learning. A lot of the times when I switch jobs, it's because I get bored. So if you like the place that you're at, but you're bored, try to move into a different tech stack or move into something that's interesting to you, like volunteer for new opportunities, because it's really easy at big companies to coast. And when you coast, I feel like you lose your edge. Technology changes very fast. So if you always learn and never stay, like never let yourself get bored, which to me usually happens around 1 to 3 years lately. If you don't let yourself get bored, then you have a better chance of either staying where you're at or at least advancing your skill set to continue learning.
Cool, awesome. Thank you for all the advice that was given. We'll kind of just jump into the questions that were in that Slido link. So with these questions, feel free to kind of just jump in with whatever questions. Hopefully with 5 panels, it'll be okay. We'll kind of see how things go. But the first question that I think most people wanted to know is age preference a real thing for entry-level software engineer roles? And how much of a factor is school name once you've gotten the interview? And then we can kind of just go ahead. If anyone has some input, feel free to just jump in.
And I can start since I've been going last the entire time. So I am going to be 38 this year, which to me is ancient in the startup world. I have worked at startups where I'm the oldest person by at least 10 years or more. That didn't prevent me from getting the job. So and I live in Atlanta, so the startup scene here is probably a little bit different than those of the people that live in California, but it is thriving. And I haven't felt any negative impact to my age trying to come in when I was first trying to break into software development. At Airbus, we have a 30-person office right now in Atlanta where we have hired junior team members in their mid to late 30s and junior team members who are straight out of college. So I really haven't seen that there's an age preference. For those of you that are coming out of college, it's like the more traditional route, I think, to be younger, but I also think it's okay to be older as long as you show that you want to be there. That's all people really want to see, is that you want to be there. And I think that was, for school name, we are near Georgia Tech. So we do tend to get a lot of Georgia Tech people coming to apply. It's just, I think it's because it's geographical To me, school name doesn't matter. I think the other senior engineers at my company, the school name doesn't matter. But I don't know if that's the same for everyone. All I care about is, do you look like you can do the job?
Yep. That.
I can add a little bit to that. So this guy decided to come in here. Ageism is real, but it's like one of those things that I know it exists. I've heard it exists, but I've been fortunate enough. I'm 38. I wish I was 38. I got you beat. Almost a decade. I have not. I've been fortunate enough that I haven't run into it. But one thing that younger people entering, there's positives and negatives, right? So if you're younger and you're entering the job force, what employers may not tell you, what they look at is somebody that does not have probably one of these, doesn't have a lot of distractions and can work a lot more. When I was in my 20s, 30s and single, I could focus on the job 20 hours a day if I wanted to. Now, not so much. So you kind of want to find a company that is going to look past that. Now, that's not always easy to do, but that's definitely something to think about. In my experience, mostly you want to be interviewing. If a company is going to be more cognizant of your age overtly, then that's probably not the right company to be interviewing for. There is nothing but opportunity right now. Like other panelists have said, this industry is still booming. So if you're interviewing in a company that is, where is everybody based? Is this all virtual? So everyone's all over?
Yep, all virtual. So
okay.
Yeah, we have a wide range of people.
Okay. Yeah. So you want to find a company that's going to interview you for fit. I wouldn't worry too much about the age thing, because there's a lot of people coming out of school. So that's not going to differentiate you too much.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I think adding on to that from personal experience, a lot of people also have been recently like these kind of like coding boot camp have really taken off. So within Pinterest, we also do hire people from those boot camps. And honestly, at the end of the day, what happens is kind of just how well you do at your job. Like, I don't really know if someone's like done a coding boot camp and like, I don't actually really think about their background. So for my day-to-day, it doesn't really affect me too much, or like, I don't really think there's prejudice against people with different backgrounds or like from who are like older or younger. Yeah, cool. If no one else wants to jump in, we can kind of move on to the next question. All right, so someone has a question specifically for Mike. What is the interview process like for cybersecurity related positions at Salesforce compared to software engineer positions?
Well, I can't. So my role is actually both. I'm hired on a niche team, threat intelligence team, to be a software engineer. So sorry guys, hang on one sec. Well, we're just gonna have to deal with it because my wife is away right now. So let me answer the first question. What is it like to interview for at Salesforce for a security role? I'm going to tell you again that be careful with abstraction, especially for role in CompSec, because you are going to be exposed to a lot of different things at a lot of different layers. So knowing the OSI model is important. Knowing the difference between a connection-oriented protocol and a connectionless one. You're going to be looking at, you should be familiar with looking at packet traces, PCAP files. Sure, you can use Wireshark and things like that to abstract that away, but know the difference fundamentally. Like if somebody says to you, this traffic is UDP based versus TCP based, understand the differences there. Contrast that against a software engineering role. You're not going to necessarily be asked to know, give me the most optimal data structure for, you're not going to be asked data structures questions. You shouldn't be, unless you're interviewing to be a dev on a security team. So that's a little different. those are the most important. I look at like security roles because I interview for a lot of security related roles and software engineering roles. I kind of think of it in the way that DevOps was thought about 5 years ago, and that's somewhat of a jack of all trades. So you got to kind of know, sure, you also want to know what the landscape looks like of current products, because there's different areas obviously to interview in security. So if someone has a more specific question of what type of security role, if it's like red team for pen testing, or if it's like, product security engineer, then of course that's going to be a little more software related in terms of designing secure software and such.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks for answering that.
Let me add one thing. If anyone
Okay.
wants to PM me here and ask further questions, feel free to do that, and I can also provide my email address. I'm happy to do that as well.
Yeah, I think at the end of the class, I'll just ask all the panelists for their emails and any contact information if people have further questions. Jumping into the next question, someone asks, what are some of the most interesting side projects you've seen on resumes, and what experiences do you value, such as like freelancing? That's the question.
I can speak to that a bit. So I would say that it's not so much about what the project is, it's about how you talk about it, especially like if it's an interview process. So some people, interns or new grads I've interviewed, have had, an interesting project, and then I'll ask them about it. And it was a group project, and actually their part was pretty small, and they're kind of stuffing their resume a little bit, which is fine as long as they're honest about it, but there's been projects where someone has, I remember there was an intern one time who I was interviewing, and they had worked during a summer, and it was a project that seemed boring to them. And it was kind of, I guess, boring when they talked about it with their friends about what they did for their summer internship. But when they spoke to me about it, they were very passionate about the work that they had done in it. And it turned out that some of the work that they'd done in it was, it had some slightly more advanced kind of engineering elements to it, which was very interesting to talk to them about, and they were able to talk about it confidently. So to me, that was a better thing than someone having a cool project that they weren't actually all that knowledgeable about and didn't really have a lot of a part in it. So I would say it's just echoing back to what we started with too, is that it's really just about, if you can bring that passion and talk about what it was, what excited you about this project, especially if there was a problem you ran into, being able to explain how you debugged a problem, or how you had to maybe even re-architect something in the middle of a project. Like, that kind of requirements change all the time in our industry. And that's one of the biggest things coming out of academia to the real work, is that product managers will come to you 2 weeks into a project and say, okay, everything we were doing, we're not doing that anymore. We're doing something else. And like, these are realities that you kind of have to learn some skills around how to handle those situations. And so, anything that kind of, if you can talk about some of those other experiences that you've had that are different than just, I sat down and coded this, those can go a long way.
Yeah, I think great advice in general. Is there anyone else who wanted to jump in and add on?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk a little bit about it from like the AI ML side. So a lot of, like, I've seen so many NLP Twitter bots and newsfeed sentiment analysis that, the next one I see, like, it doesn't faze me at all. And I know it's like, especially with the AI ML, like, everyone's going to do a housing price predictor. Everyone's going to do a news sentiment analysis or some summary thing. And like, I totally understand why people do it, because they're easy projects that you can put a lot of them on your resume. They look pretty cool. But I'm really impressed when somebody shows something that's like kind of out there and it's a little bit different, and they took like a unique approach to solving the problem. Because, like, the problem we're doing, automating bookkeeping and accounting, like, bookkeeping and accounting has been around forever, but we took a unique approach on it. So seeing how you're able to take like a common project and put a unique twist on it, that was really interesting. And also going off what Alex said about talking about a problem, like, one of the interview questions I ask is like, okay, like, tell me like the hardest problem you've solved, and then we deep dive into it. And then I quickly am able to tell if you were the one who actually solved the problem, or if you were on the team that solved the problem. Because if you solved the problem, even a year or 2 later, you should be able to walk me down through the very specific roadmap of how you solved it, all of the you know, the twists and turns you took. So go after a hard side project, I would say.
Yeah, definitely great advice. Well, I'll kind of see if anyone else wants to jump in, but if not, I think the next question would be, is there a type of engineer that's kind of under the radar right now, but will be in high demand within the next couple of years?
I can fire away at this a little bit. It's not even under the radar necessarily, but the move to public cloud is real. And perhaps this is due to my previous experience where we built our own bespoke cloud. We were a SaaS company, but the cost benefits of moving to public cloud to AWS, GCP, and Azure is phenomenal, especially at scale. A lot of companies are putting a lot of their money where their mouth is and already have. So knowing these cloud platforms is hugely important. Roles also like SREs, like the Google site reliability engineer, which is sort of seems to be like the modern day, well, the current DevOps thing, which was like I said, 5 to 7 years ago, that was sort of the new hotness. Those two seem to be you wouldn't go wrong knowing these roles and specializing in skills that these jobs require.
I can kind of hop in and kind of say a funny joke, which is like, it's like all of them. The trend in the US is actually pretty, I think the line people say now is like, every company is a tech company, they just don't know it. Like the chair company is really a tech company. And it's even in like simple ways, we're all, say, software engineers, so we think of technology, oh, it's AI, but just even basic automation doesn't exist in like the majority of, say, American companies outside of, say, where we live. At least I live in the Bay Area. And then if you go to Latin America, you go to, I spent a lot of time in India recently, they're going through what we went through like 10, 15 years ago, because they're all getting access to mobile phones. One other way to think about what a new trend is, so maybe 10 years ago, the iPhone came out and that was such a seminal moment. And then now you have iOS engineers and Android engineers. And it's still the same thing, like you're a software engineer, you learn Objective-C or Swift or Kotlin, whatever. It's the same thing, all of you might see some emerging trend that'll change everything, whether it's, Bitcoin has something or VR, like, there's all these interesting technologies that are on the cusp. And then, is it next year, or like, is this Facebook thing, their blockchain thing a flop, or is that huge? And that can create a wave of opportunity that didn't exist. But I will say, my career is pretty funny. Like when I started, my first internships were in like 99, 2000, and it's like, oh, this internet thing is hot. And then again in 2008, it's hot. And now it's like, 20 years later, it's still like the hottest, it's still like a hot thing. I can't imagine just being a regular old back-end engineer or a full stack engineer will be going away in the next 20 years. So.
Yeah, that's all right. I don't think I'm not sure if anyone else wanted to jump in.
Well, I'll say it then if no one else has. Knowing that ML is probably going to help too.
So I'll jump in there. So one thing I see a lot of, like when we're interviewing, especially people right out of college, is everyone knows how to write an ML model. Like everyone loves to be like, oh, I know how to write the ML model. We don't write our own ML models here at BotKeeper. We take the scikit-learn and we import it. We use a logistic regression algorithm or a neural net or something like that. And what a lot of people end up struggling with is how to connect that model to the rest of the system. And that's like a skill that's been super difficult to find, especially with recent college graduates. So understanding like how ML works as like a whole and a part of the whole architecture, and actually how you move that data through the pipeline, because there are services like Datadog and Google's AutoML, like they've democratized the process of building ML models. So what you need and what hasn't been democratized is the feature engineering, like cleaning the data, normalizing it, putting through the pipelines. So if you're going to spend time on that, ML is great to know, but really focus your effort on the whole data cleansing, the data normalization, your data pipeline, because you're so much more valuable. And then you can't be replaced by a service because that is unique to each company and unique to each problem. So you'll make yourself so much more valuable.
Yeah, definitely have seen that firsthand too at where I work too. So, cool. The next question. Okay, cool. Sorry, the people are kind of like voting in real time, so it kind of jumps in terms of rankings. So the next question looks like, is there any advice you wish you were given when you were interviewing, and any just resume tips in general?
I can give a few tips. I think at least this is, and I feel like resumes, everyone has their personal viewpoints on them. What I tend to see in a lot of resumes is people use way too much words. A lot of the times you want to just pad it out so it looks really full, which is kind of hard to do when you're young and you don't have a lot of job experience. But people are scanning resumes, so if you have like a ton of words on there, for me, I have a tendency to just like blank out. Usually it has gone through recruiters at that point and they're looking for buzzwords, keywords. So I would make sure you have at least like 3 people that aren't related to you review your resume and make sure that they can give you real feedback that may be extremely hurtful once you get it. I had my husband give me my resume feedback and it really hurt my feelings, but he was completely right because it was terrible when I gave it to him. So I gave it to my mom and she thought it was awesome. So that, make sure that you have more people review it, make sure it's easily scannable, easily readable, easily digestible, and maybe don't try to bloat it out too much because people want to see what you can do and they're not looking for a 2-page resume when you're just coming out of college.
I would add that to the best of your ability, don't take any of it personal. When you're interviewing, a lot of things may happen. You will evoke a lot of emotions and you may get nervous. It's very common. You may ramble a lot. You may not talk. A lot of different things happen. But regardless of any of that, whatever the decision is, if it's not to your liking, do not take it personal and do not let it discourage you, because there will be a lot of times where you will get kicked and cast aside. It's never personal. Just pick yourself up, dust yourself off, learn from it, and move on. And that's like just general life advice, but it also works well for interviewing.
Maybe one thing I'll add is this is something I actually got. It took me a while to get this advice around the concept of storytelling and how that's so important in an interview. Normally, you get asked a question, you answer it. But if you think about most interviews, half of them are behavioral-based interviews. Like, tell me about the hardest thing you worked on. And I think this point Alex made earlier about how the interview candidate wants to like you, right? They want to have a good experience. My advice, maybe if you just Google like the Muse storytelling or storytelling in interviews, you'll find lots of articles. There's different frameworks you can use. One of the things is called STAR. You describe the situation, the task, the action you did, the result. You kind of think of it from the other person's perspective, right? They're like, imagine at some of these larger companies, they're just slogging through interviews all day long. They'd rather be coding than spending time with you potentially. So your job almost is to flip this like one-way interrogation or this like, potential, 30 minutes or 45 minutes into kind of a fun experience. So, another piece of advice is gives like, always smile. Like, I don't know, if you smile, people smile back. Like, it could be that you're like so stressed out, right? Because it's like, like anything with practice, it becomes more easier. But if you can make it more into, a good 2-way conversation, and, back to the storytelling, write it down, as Terry mentioned, practice with other people, right? The first time, if you ask me a question, I'll bomb it, right? But if I practice it 100 times, I'll probably be a little bit better. So those are some tips.
I have one specific resume thing to throw in. I had a referral come through from a new grad that was working on our team, and she said, this friend's looking for a job. Can you talk to him? And so we didn't have a position, but I just sort of wanted to give him some advice anyway. And at one point, it was just really bugging me, and I asked him, "Where did you get this resume template from?" Because I was like, I'll see 100 of this exact resume every week. And he said, "Oh, it was given to us by our school. It was like a thing." And I think that's a great start. But then what you want to do is you really want to personalize it. There's an engineer And she ended up not being a fit for the position that we were interviewing for, but this was like 3 years ago, and I still remember her resume. And if the right position came up, I would still reach out to her now. I would go back and try to reach out. And it's just because she was interviewing for a front-end position, and the resume was very visually dynamic, and it had the important information, but it just showed like, oh, this person has these other kind of skills, and they kind of know what they want to do. And even if it's a back-end resume, just being able to make it not exactly the same as everyone else's. Sometimes the harsh reality is you're going through a bunch of different layers. Sometimes there's recruiters, talent acquisition people. You're going to sometimes a resume review at a larger company within different teams. And so as much as it shouldn't be the case, the most that you can kind of like make yours stand out from the pile a little bit and be a bit different, people are going to take notice of that, and it just hedges your bet of landing on the right table and having the right person notice it.
Cool. Yeah. So I'm kind of looking at the questions, and there's kind of like a general theme around resumes, and it's mostly just like, what do you guys look for when you're screening for resumes? Someone asks, do they focus on like GPA as opposed to extracurricular coding projects? Like, what in particular I think stands out to you content-wise?
For me, it really like that's the resume just provides a little bit of context, and I'm really I might ask a few questions on things that are stand out, but honestly, I'm going to ask a lot of questions and make my decisions based on the questions I ask, less so. I understand the resume is how you it's like your reputation, right? It speaks for you when you're not there, kind of thing. So my decision is largely going to be made based on the actual interview, and less so on what's on the resume, unless, of course, never put anything on the resume that you can't back up. So make sure that everything on the resume is 100%, single source of truth for you and your professional and academic career.
One thing I'd add is actually following Mike's point. The purpose of the resume in the process is to get you to an interview, right? So, because then the purpose of the interview is then to hopefully make it to the next stage. Or when I think of, resumes I get, it's basically how do you stand out, right? So actually I'll bifurcate it two ways. So if it's a startup, there's actually ways to like get to those founders or those leaders of the company as opposed to just like you send in, I mean, maybe this is true actually for all jobs, even big companies too, actually. Can you actually network to somebody, send a nice email? Everybody's hiring, everybody's short on jobs. The challenge I find, I've worked with a lot of large HR organizations at different companies, they just get this like pool of resumes. They might not read it, they might scan it. And that's actually doing a disservice to you because you've done all this hard work. So what are like maybe the two biggest tips? One is maybe customize each resume for the job you're applying to, like the job/company. So if you're applying to, what is the example, Salesforce, security, SRE, that resume should look totally opposite than if you applied to say Eruditus as a React engineer, right? You would then focus on React, maybe look at our website, every company shows their values, right? Maybe our values are something, you describe an extracurricular project directly related to those values. Those are, how do you then elevate your resume compared to the other resumes that organization is looking at or that hiring manager has?
This is good advice, tailoring the resume. Also, where you can learn, well, how do I tailor my resume for what the company may want? Certainly doing a little bit of due diligence on the company itself is important, but also, it hasn't been said yet, it should be said, Glassdoor and levels.fyi. Both of these sites are very good tools to help you select companies and then optimize your chances of getting your resume selected. And then once you're there, before the interview, helping you with that process.
I'll add one thing at the end of that, because I think AJ made a really good point from you as well, but I think AJ made a really good point when he kind of glossed over like networking. Resumes are great. And there's only been one job that I've had that I got not through just cold resume submission. And those job hunts that I went on where I was doing cold resume submissions, I'm not gonna lie, they suck. I submitted like hundreds of job applications and no one answers you, or they do and they're like, no. Or you get to the interview and then it's still no. And they're long and they're hard, and it can be really hard on you as a person. I like obviously don't take it personally, but if it takes you 2 months to find a job, which it did out of my coding boot camp, it took me 2 whole months to find a job, which really sucked. I just happened to be friends with someone that knew someone that worked at Airbus, and it's someone that I worked with before, and he kind of like gave me an in. That in helped me bypass a lot of the resume process by just getting a recommendation from someone that works there. So I wouldn't gloss over the resume stuff. It's all really important. They're going to want to see it, but networking is also extremely important. I go to meetup groups that are local to Atlanta and have met so many people there that if I wanted to go get a job at MailChimp, I know like 5 people that work there. I can go and easily get my resume in front of the right people. So you kind of have to attack things in multiple spaces.
Yeah, this is again, I agree with this. This is the whole, in the same bucket is making these relationships and these friendships and carrying them with you. Because once you build that solid core network of people, it's easier to build other lateral relationships. And oh, hey, my buddy knows that so and so's hiring. I think you'd be a good fit for that. That's a shorter path than just going to the front door.
Yeah, I'll just toss in one more point because actually, now that I think of my career, my first I did 2 internships at Amazon and Microsoft, and those were like the cold email submissions. But actually, after that, my next 20 years I've actually never applied to a job. It's all been through the network. You tell people you're looking, or you reach out and say, hey, I'm looking to try to do this thing, and then people connect you to other people. You attend meetups. Yeah, don't undervalue the how impactful that can be. And then the big one is you actually get higher quality jobs because really great openings usually have great leaders and they have great networks. And I think Mike was talking about this a lot, about how he had a network early in his career and that sustained his whole career. Same thing with me as well.
Yeah, and that's true. I've been fortunate in that's been the case, but my experience is different from all of yours. I didn't go to college. But one thing I will say though, that it's so important to interview a lot, often. Even when you're happy in the job you're in, I think every few years or whatever the cadence for you might be, it's good to put yourself in harm's way and go out and be uncomfortable. This is how you grow and learn, and you never know what may come from it. Even if you don't want, sometimes it's the most powerful position to be in is you're not really wanting a job. I ended up at Salesforce. I didn't want to leave Farsight. I was a staunch Kool-Aid drinker at Farsight, and would have gone down with the ship there, or wrote it to acquisition. But I just went out and talked to a handful of different companies because it was time for me to manage my career. I hadn't done that in a few years, so I talked to a few companies, and it turns out that Salesforce was doggedly, they were dogged in their pursuit, and it just ended up happening that way. But interview, get out there, do it. Get uncomfortable. It's inherently an uncomfortable thing. But some people, you may find that you really enjoy it, you thrive, be put on the spot.
I wanted to touch on the GPA and the schools a bit, because I think that's come up in 1 or 2 questions. I know from experience at larger companies that GPA was definitely a factor for internships. So I think at Yahoo, they wouldn't bring anyone on with an internship if it was like less than 3.5 GPA or something like that. Like they had firm rules about it. And there's a bunch of reasons for that are, there are business reasons for it, but there's a couple other larger companies that I've seen do the same sort of thing. A lot of companies now, when they're hiring full-time engineers, they don't care. They don't look at that. Part of it is also just that people are understanding bias and the fact that those aren't very inclusive sort of things to do, and that you don't necessarily get higher quality candidates by looking at GPA or schools. There's a lot of great engineers that I've worked with in my career who you end up being friends with them and talking with them, and it's like they never went to university, or they went to university in a different type of degree and then switched, or maybe they did terribly in school because school wasn't applied enough for them, and then once they're out is where they really were able to grow themselves a lot more. And so I think you're seeing a lot of companies change their attitude on that and sort of understand that that doesn't represent necessarily how someone's going to operate in the workplace. But there might be a little bit of that bias that exists on certain teams or in certain large companies to some degree.
Yeah, I think that generally find that to be the case as well, where as I've been kind of on the other side of things and doing kind of industry hire interviews, a lot of people, actually quite a few people just don't even have their resume, or not resume, have their GPA on their resume, and it's just not something I even look at anymore. So yeah, definitely great perspective. So we only, okay, so I'm kind of just looking at the general like questions being asked in the Slido. So one kind of general theme that seems to be popping up is like kind of what is your perspective on like the startup experience versus like big company experience. So a lot of people are kind of just asking like basically to optimize for learning, do you think startups or bigger companies are better? And also like how do you, I guess, evaluate someone who has like a startup experience that maybe like the startup failed versus someone who just spent that same amount of time at a big corporation? So just like general thoughts on startups versus big companies.
I don't know if this is a real saying, but I know I've heard it a few times. Is 1 year of startup experience is 3 years of corporate experience. So if you don't have a ton of time in your career and you want to get some experience, go work at a startup for your first year. And because just being a startup, you're going to wear so many different hats because you're going to be thrown in the deep end. We kind of joke that at a startup, they're going to drag you out to the middle of the ocean, leave you there and see if you can kind of sink or swim, just because startups are usually resource constrained and it's more. So if you're a self-motivated person, startups are great. But if you really want some more of the hand holding and some more of the structured learning, like in college, I know like I worked at B of A and they have so many resources at their disposal. And just basically it's almost like college, which is pretty awesome. So there's just kind of two different paths, but you can get the same experience at either one.
Yeah, I mean, largely my experience is pretty much in line with that. I've worked at two large companies in my career, Cisco and Salesforce, and a lot of startups in between, and a few medium-sized companies. And sure, startups, if you're asking, you spent a year at a startup and it failed, you're going to probably have learned a lot of great experience during watching this startup fail for whatever the reason. I mean, most startups fail, but you're going to learn a lot versus sometimes being in a large corporate company where you can feather a nest and kind of just get settled into the status quo. There's some security there, sure. There's also great opportunity to learn, because a lot of people have made the mistakes. The company has made some mistakes, but also learned where to succeed. So you're going to focus more on in those areas. You're also going to probably be working on much more narrowly focused projects and teams in larger companies. Two things about failure: should be a welcome addition to your resume and your general life experience. And people always say this, but it's really true. And there's two quick stories I'll give. One is the Jack Welch story. I believe it was Jack Welch. Someone else told this to me that there was one of his EVPs made some mistake. Jack Welch was the CEO of GE, very famous CEO of his time. I think in the 90s, right? 80s, 90s, something like that. And one of his EVPs made a mistake, cost the company like $1 billion. And he says, "I'm sorry, Jack, I'll clean out my desk. My bad." And Jack says, I'll clean it up. It was told to me with more colorful language. He says, why would I want you to quit? I just spent $1 billion in your education. So that's the kind of awesome mentality that I'd love to see in other companies. And the other is that if you're constantly succeeding or in a situation where you're really succeeding, I played professional poker for 12 years, lived in Vegas and all that. And one of the anecdotal tales that always ran through my mind is that when you're winning and succeeding, sometimes it's really hard to tell the difference between running good and playing good. And the way you can adapt this in the real world is it's really hard to tell the difference between being in the right place, right time, and getting lucky and sort of just continuing in that vein versus sorry. So when you're winning a lot and running good, it's really hard to tell the difference between good luck and playing well. So sometimes the failures need to come in to show you where you're really like, oh, I'm doing the wrong thing here. I did the wrong thing. That was, you know, I learned that much quicker than I would had I just sort of continued on this cadence of things were easy. I hope that ended up making sense.
It did. I would agree with everyone. And since I worked at startups, I also spent 10 years as a consultant. So that's kind of like a middle ground where I was a full-time employee, but consulting at different firms is the reason why I stayed so long at that one company, because changing customers, I didn't get bored. Had I gotten bored, I would have probably jetted way sooner. So I had more of like the security that you get being at a big company is nice. I do think that you will move a little bit slower just as companies grow. Like Airbus is huge. The ability to make a decision is so much different at a huge company than when you're at a small startup and you're the only dev or one of two devs. You just make the decision and you move with it. I don't remember the other person's name that said, but you do end up having to wear like 5+ hats because there's not a DevOps person, there's not a backend person. You may be the only person that fulfills all those roles. So it can be a little bit more stressful. But I think the opportunity to learn is both places. You just kind of have to look at what you want out of the job. If you're okay with a little bit more high stress and you want to learn really fast, the startup may be a better place. Consulting may be kind of a nice middle ground, so you don't have to have the worry of working at a startup, but you can still learn by hopping from client to client. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with working at a corporation for multiple years. I mean, I never thought I'd be at a big company, and like here I am. So you never know.
I think with my experience too, just echoing again, sort of what Terry and I think Justin and Mike all said, that definitely there are more opportunities for responsibility at startups where because of the smaller team size, you can take on more things if you're up to it. My experience has been that I've had great and terrible experiences at both startups and large companies, and that what it came down to for me when I look back on those is really what was the team and what was the manager like. And those are the things that you kind of get through the interview or through networking, building that network like Mike was talking about. And those are the ones where you can really get a sense of, okay, is this the team that is going to support me? You know, because you could be at a startup and they won't give you the opportunity to wear all those hats. They'll just try to burn you out as a code for hire kind of a thing. And so you want to make sure if you're going that route that you're going to have that opportunity if you want to push yourself as an engineer and maybe not only do backend, but do DevOps and maybe, you know, do some front end or work with, make product decisions, those sorts of things, that you're going to have that support and actually be able to do that. And then similarly on the large company, it's the same sort of thing. You know, are you going to just be are you going to be, you know, the B team who's just doing maintenance on an old mail like calendar product or something for 3 years, and it's something that no one really cares about and is going to be deprecated? Or do you have a manager who's from day one thinking about a career path for you and getting to know you as an engineer and saying, okay, what are the things that you kind of want to grow into, or what are experiences that I can throw at you and you can see? So I would say more than that decision, or when you're considering, you know, between different startups or something or different large companies, is the kind of the next step, focus on the management and the team and really try to find a place that's going to support you either way.
Yeah, I think all really great advice. Yeah, I think when you're like a new grad or an intern, I think especially when I was interviewing as a new grad, I didn't realize like how important these questions were. So I think it's always something to keep in your mind as you're recruiting. And then I think we probably only have time for 1 or 2 questions, but I think looking at what people upvoted, do you compare yourself against other people's at your workplace? And how do you effectively deal with imposter syndrome?
You know, there are a lot of smart people out there, and you know, the whole goal is to not be the smartest person in the room so you can learn from other people. You know, one way I've dealt with it is when I feel insecure about like not knowing something or kind of jealous that another coworker knows something, I put that on my learning roadmap, and I make sure that I go learn that. So it's kind of a good way to kind of curate what you should be learning and doing. But everyone has strengths and weaknesses. That's why companies are teams and not single individuals. So try to align. Like when we were hiring at BotKeeper, the first hires I made were the areas that I sucked at, and at that time it was DevOps and front end. So I hired those two people. So you don't need to be the best at everything. Everybody has a lot of great skills, but if you do find yourself jealous, then learn what they know, and then you won't be jealous anymore.
Well, I'll add to that. Imposter syndrome is certainly a real thing, and just like every engineer at every level, from intern to distinguished engineer, copies and pastes from Stack Overflow, everybody suffers from imposter syndrome. It's constant. I haven't met anyone that doesn't have it to some degree. I've had to learn how to deal with it constantly, and it's very interesting that it just wells up in you sometimes and sneaks up on you, and you feel like, I don't know anything. It's usually not the case. It's one of those things where you just have to learn how to accept it, comfortably live with it and deal with it, and understand that it's most often irrational. And if it turns out that you constantly have imposter syndrome about a specific thing, then maybe you need to go and learn that specific thing a little bit better. So seeking out mentors is a very helpful thing in that case. But just know that it's a constant thing, especially in this hyper competitive world that we're all in, the engineering world.
I'll give maybe a different spin on some of this, which is, it's an interesting topic where, I've actually definitely seen it where people look at others and, it's a comparison game. And some of it, at least for me personally, comes with my childhood. It's like Asian background. So it's like, if you're not like number one, like you're the worst. And if you think about it, like it's philosophical, like actually what's the goal in life? And for everyone's different, but it's just to be happy. And now we're in this team sport called working at a company or working at a startup, where actually, if you look at this industry, everything is just rising, right? So that almost mentality, and that mentality actually gets trained because when you're in school, they might do a bell curve, or when you're, trying to get into college, this is why universities are like, in some ways pretty illogical. Only the top X% get into the top university, as opposed to like, why can't anybody who's at least at some bar get in, right? So actually, it's almost like we've been trained for our entire lives, or at least I was to kind of, you're competing with others. And then suddenly we're in a model where it's actually not about competition. I'll actually give a pitch for something different. For some people, therapy is actually the right answer. Now we talk a lot about mental illness. We talk about, there's different ways to get help through it, because it can actually really wear you down and take away joy and happiness from your life. Because if that's like the end goal, you don't want that to stop you. The other aspect I like to think about is like, I look at my teams today, like my VP of engineering, he was doing construction 10 years ago, right? Like literally, and we're, a unicorn company doing 100 million in revenue, right? So you have like amazing, like there are tons of great role models out there who came from different backgrounds, didn't think they're gonna make it. So I think this group can definitely do it for sure.
Cool. Yeah, I think it's just something everyone has to deal with. It sucks. I think just going on in your career, you'll realize that it happens to everyone and it's not a problem specific to you. So I think we'll kind of wrap up with the last question, maybe last one or two questions. How did you find out what you really like doing versus what you thought you liked doing while you're in school?
I could say I did not like what I was doing in school, but I was super deep into debt. So I finished my degree. My degree is in computer engineering, and I despise electrical engineering so much. And I wanted to be a developer, which I also didn't do, but we already talked about that. So it just took me time. I mean, you have to try out different things. If you don't like what you're doing in school, maybe don't go get a job in that. I didn't, it was the right move. If I had gone and gotten an electrical engineering job, I had been interning at Motorola and I could have probably gone and gotten a job there, but I was so miserable. You're not going to be less miserable. If you're miserable doing something, you are not going to be less miserable. It does not matter how much money they pay you. Maybe if it's like $1 million a year, but the same thing with QA. I left QA and I took a pay cut to be a dev. I was so miserable at the end of my QA career. I did not care to take a pay cut because I knew I would be happier doing something that I enjoyed. I was very fortunate to be able to take a pay cut. That's not always something that people can do. But for me, the stress level of being so unhappy was worth taking the cut. So I think just AJ was right. Like, what are you trying to do in life? I was trying to be happy. So I pushed myself towards that. And, you know, that's my experience with it.
Yeah, I'll tell you a short story. When I was in college, I started off as a communications major. And then this is back in probably like 2011 or 12. And then I thought I was going to create the next Facebook. And so I had no business training. I had no programming experience. So I was like, okay, I'll create the company and then just go hire a developer. Quickly realized that I couldn't pay for a developer. So basically wrote a business plan for about 6 months and just kept thinking I was going to be the next Mark Zuckerberg. Then after that, I was like, okay, enough is enough. I put the company, put the company on hold, and then I learned how to code on lynda.com. And I can tell you to this day, I was at the University of Tampa. I was in Brevard Hall, sitting on this super uncomfortable couch, and it was like the morning, and I was following a JavaScript course on Lynda. And as soon as I made the computer say "Hello World," I was like, "Holy shit, that's what I'm gonna do for the rest of my life." And but you know, even my parents back then, they're like, "Justin, don't be a developer. Like, you're a business person. Like, you need to, manage and lead the all these people." So be open to taking those risks and just experiment. Have that beginner's mindset and just don't be afraid to really experiment. And you don't know what you like, and it'll be a constant. All the time you're like, wow, I didn't even know I like this. So just be open to new opportunities.
My experience was the last year of my degree, I took a whole bunch of like AI courses. Like that was pretty much all my senior level stuff. And then I worked at a bank for like 4 or 5 years and I just hated it. And it got to the point where I took a year just traveling and I was like, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe this wasn't the career for me. Like I thought I was always interested in computer stuff and I was like, maybe I screwed up. And it took sort of eventually, I moved cities and stuff and I just started at a startup just to kind of make some money while I was figuring stuff out. And going back to the thing that we've gone back to a lot of times, again, Mike's thing about, and I guess other people have mirrored this too, about that network. I just met somebody, this other engineer at the company, and he really inspired me and he connected me to sort of the parts of engineering that I liked, actually. And then everything was just like, oh no, I was just in the completely wrong kind of track of things. I got into stuff that was kind of interesting from an academic standpoint, but when it was applied, it just didn't really work with the way that I was going. And then I got connected more to kind of the web technology again. And I was like, oh, this is what I really enjoy. And then everything kind of kicked off from there again for me.
Okay, awesome. Thank you guys for answering all the questions. I think before everyone heads out, is there any kind of like last piece of advice you wanted to give or like parting words?
I'll say one thing that I actually just mentioned to an engineer that I was talking to about career planning and things like that is also like, just have fun. Like, you're in this panel, you're hearing all this advice. Don't stress too much either. Like, remember that these are also like, especially if you're a new grad and stuff, these are the fun years. You're having all these new experiences. You're going to be meeting all these new people from the job. Like, you don't at each one-on-one have to be thinking and talking with your manager about your career plan. You can get to know them as people. You can, enjoy the work atmosphere, find things, explore other hobbies, figure out ways that your work applies to other things or other things apply to your work. But just like make sure that you're taking that time for like self-care and not overthinking things way too much, as a lot of engineers have a tendency to do.
I love the comment about self-care, because something that I think people tend to do when I was young, when I did it, you just work like a million hours and you completely forget to do other things besides work, or you program after work. And if that's what you like to do, if you want to spend like 20 hours a day programming, by all means do it. But cultivating other experiences for yourself is very important to not burn out. Especially if you're working at a startup, they're totally awesome. You're working 20 hours a week or 20 hours a day. I never could pull that off. I'm actually not a night owl. I'm like the weirdest programmer. I don't like to stay up late. I never have. I don't pull all-nighters. And I'm a morning person. So I like to work like 8 to 5, 8 to 5:30, normal business working hours. And that's okay. I've worked at companies where that is okay. And it's not expected for me to work 12-hour days. I'm not productive like that. So just remember, like, to have fun. Like so bad with names. I'm looking at you right now in your flower shirt. It's very nice. So just remember to have fun and do other stuff just besides work, because you don't want to look back at 35 and be like, oh man, I spent the last 15 years working.
If you guys want a book suggestion, sounds like it may be familiar here based on the Keep Hearing Optimized for Learning, but The Effective Engineer, I think it was Edmund Lou. It's a good book.
Yeah. I think my advice is back to the learning bit is just write a lot of code, and hopefully it matches what Alex was saying. It's a lot of fun. That's what I'm doing later today. It's like, and it also like builds a craft that is potentially a career now.
Awesome. Thank you guys. For the last, or I guess like last 40 minutes or 45 minutes or so, we're just kind of going to jump into the class content. So thank you everyone for coming in. I'll kind of ask for everyone's emails. So if students have other questions that we didn't get to, we'll get the emails and contact information there so that you guys can reach out. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Right.
Thank you.
Cool. So thank you guys for contributing, I think, really great questions. Unfortunately, we didn't have the time to go through all of them, so I generally tried to read through all the questions and try to get like big picture ideas and like try to ask for generally what it seems like the theme of questions were there. So there was some conversation happening within the chat itself. So I think Mike recommended the Effective Engineer book, which is linked in the chat itself. So if you guys haven't been following that, feel free to go through and just read the conversation there. And in regards to the questions, if you don't feel like they were answered, we're actually going to try to schedule, I think, 1 or 2 more panels throughout the class. So that way we can get to everyone's questions. And I think as you're progressing through the course, if this spawns off like other questions you want answered, you'll have the opportunity there to get those addressed. And as always, like there's always me, there'll be like Tony, there'll be other instructors kind of funneling through this class. So if you ever have questions that you want to ask us specifically, we're always here to answer questions after class as well. So with that being said, for the rest of class, since we really only have 45 minutes left, what I'll do today is I kind of will briefly talk on just about good coding practices and tips in general. And then we'll basically spend, it looks like, around like 30 to 40 minutes just going through kind of like 2 coding questions that I've picked out. So we're not doing mock interviews today just because of our schedule and then we don't have scheduled to do it. But in the future weeks, we'll have a lot more of those. Cool. So I'll kind of just present my screen and then let me share it really quickly. Share. Okay, cool. So talked about this before. I just today want to cover kind of good coding practices and tips in general. So I'll talk about good coding practices. So clean code, why does it matter? I think when you're already so stressed out in an interview setting, it's hard to also think about this as well. But to be honest, like as an interviewer, I will evaluate like an interviewee's coding quality. So it kind of does matter, and it's ideally kind of a skill you'll build up throughout this course. So the other reason, not just that like the interviewers will evaluate the code quality, is honestly having cleaner code. It's just easier to debug. So someone was asking like, how do you better debug? How do you kind of improve on that skill? Well, I think if you write code that is easy to read for yourself, it makes it easier to debug as well. So someone mentioned in the chat, like leak code indirectly incentivizes like dirty code that runs faster over readable fluent code. I think the one tip I have is like when I utilize leak code as a tool, I wasn't really looking at like, oh, your code is running like 99% of the time. Like I wasn't really looking at those percentages very seriously. I think it was just generally that if my code ran in like a general runtime that seems reasonable, or like looking through the discussion within those leak code questions, if the general runtime of my solution is similar to the runtimes they're implementing, then that's generally fine. So I think overall, don't fret over like the trying to get in the top percentile, having like a submission that's faster than everyone else's. I think what matters more is that your solution is relatively efficient, but more importantly, like is at the end of the day, if I were to read your code, like, can I understand what it's doing? Because ultimately as an interviewer, like what matters to me is that if I work with this person, I can understand their code and that their code is easy to understand. So that's also like another skill that the interviewer wants to see. Yeah, so I think if you look through the forums, there's all these like one-line Python solution or like one-line C++ solution. Like there's all these solutions that are like one-liners that basically solve the problem. But if I read it and it's not very readable to me, that's not, like, I think number of lines of code is not truly like what should be optimized. So you kind of just want to make sure that your code is readable. So if it's one line and unreadable, then that doesn't really mean much to me as an interviewer. Yeah. Cool. So I'm just going to go through some quick exercises. So just as a quick, if anyone has recommendations, how can this code be improved? Not sure if anyone. Cool. Someone mentioned better variable names. Yeah. Cool. So I think people are just getting the hang of it. I kind of wanted to go through like what can be improved. I think a lot of times what people will do is they'll use like one letter variable names because it's really fast. But at the end of the day, like this is really confusing. And I think when you use one letter like variable names, it gets really hard to debug too. So this isn't actually n as variable name. Basically what the code is doing is just simply like from a list of numbers finding the minimum, right? So before I used x as to store the minimum, but that wasn't very clear. So yeah, so even with this one, it's not the greatest because I haven't really cleaned up all the code, but you can see kind of like how this is already better than what was before. So I think one key thing to note is just to have like pretty good descriptive naming. So I think the other thing is, all right, so you don't have to read through all of this, but here's a lot of code, right? So what I think is totally an acceptable approach for interviewing is to sometimes just tell the interviewer, hey, I suppose I have this extra method, right? So suppose like I have a method that will handle this for me. Can I kind of punt this and write out the function name and the arguments it'll take in and then implement this later so that I can kind of implement more of the, I think, what is important in terms of the solution. So in that case, like, yeah, I think definitely it's a very good approach to do that. So in this example, there's a lot of code happening. So what kind of you can do is you can kind of separate it out into two functions where maybe you're implementing this body of the first function first, and then you dive into the body of the second function. So that way, I think it also makes your code a bit easier to debug if you are in the case where you have to actually implement and run your code. And also, like, I think you don't get too distracted by trying to implement a ton of things at once. So it kind of separates out the code pretty nicely and organizes it really nicely to serve those two functions. All right, so in this class, we do a lot of like coding live, but I think there's still a lot of companies that might expect or don't provide you with a computer to code live and instead expect you to whiteboard. So I've talked about this before where I think we give you a lot of opportunity to practice like coding and like running your code, but if you have time, I definitely recommend just getting together with friends or even just practicing yourself, like how to whiteboard and get comfortable whiteboarding as well. So maybe like some good practice is we have those post-assessment questions. So instead of coding up solutions to those, try just whiteboarding out the solutions to those problems. So we give you a lot of these different problems, like try to whiteboard first for some of maybe even like the exercises that you have to submit as homework. So try whiteboarding. And so a few whiteboarding tips that I've kind of learned from just going through all these interviews myself and when I was interviewing is that you should definitely make indents really obvious. So I think actually, oh, sorry. Okay. So actually I think
and those little dumb little bugs that look like scorpion they're just getting, and they're so creepy.
Oh, sorry. Okay, cool. So yeah, I think you can never make indents too obvious, and I've fallen in the trap where it's where the indents weren't really obvious, and then I end up wasting time just trying to figure out like what the indentation is. So make your indents obvious. Also, the other thing to note is to add spacing in between your lines, because oftentimes it's really easy when you're coding up a solution to kind of go in and alter that code. But when you're whiteboarding, I think a lot of times what will happen is you'll have to go in and edit that code. So if you can, try to add at least a little bit of spacing so that it makes it easy for you to add things in and edit things out on the whiteboard. Yeah, so this allows for fixes later on if needed. And the other thing to note is use the whiteboard space efficiently. So there's only like a very limited amount of whiteboard space, and you might end up writing a lot of code on the whiteboard. So what that means is just think about kind of just like the general structure of the whiteboard. When you are kind of utilizing examples, maybe isolate the examples or like diagramming to the right side of the board so that that frees up all the left side of the board to do all your writing, right? So I think it's like a very whiteboard specific problem where you actually do tend to run out of space. So just be aware of like somewhat aware of how big your diagrams can get. And if you kind of want the diagram there in addition while you're coding, just try to make them a bit smaller so that you won't run into like this very stressful situation of having to clean up your whiteboard while you're trying to write more code. And yeah, I think as I was saying before, just start diagramming from kind of like the top left. But did anyone have any questions in just general for whiteboarding? It's not really something we will have the opportunity to do in class, but it's a very, very useful skill to practice. Off the top of my head, I know like Facebook, Google, and it sounds like Microsoft, from my personal experience and from talking to other people, the big companies still do a lot of whiteboarding. So definitely a great skill to practice. Cool. So someone asks, could you also give some tips for coding over Google Docs? Yeah, I think the follow-up answer is to practice. I actually haven't, I've heard that Google asks people to code over Google Docs. I personally haven't had to code over Google Docs. I've been in situations where, yeah, there are certain companies that I've talked to where they don't have Google Docs, but they have something equivalent where they're just asking me to write code. So I think with Google Docs, maybe ideally this, yeah, so ideally I think with Google Docs, maybe just once in a while, just practice like writing out your thoughts on like a Google Doc or like some other, all right, sorry, I'm kind of looking at the chat. Maybe the best thing to do is just to also do a similar thing to what you would be doing with whiteboarding, which is just emulate that environment and practice it and see how far you get. And honestly, at the end of the day, all these like whiteboarding tips I've accumulated are just through personal experience, right? So I've kind of like failed on my own and realized, hey, these are things I need to be cognizant of moving forward. Yeah. Okay, cool. So someone asks, can you please talk about coding practices that are followed in companies and how can I practice them in the same way? I think in general for code cleanliness, I don't want you guys to like stress out too much about it. I think it's more just like, hey, as an interviewer, like imagine, I think the best way to think about it is if I didn't really know what, like if you didn't explain to me what your code was doing, could I easily go in and read your code and kind of understand what's happening? So that's kind of like a good mindset to have when you're coding up your solutions. So is it easy for someone else to read my code and understand what's happening there, right? So that's, I think, the question you should be asking yourself as you're practicing the different problems you have. I think aside from getting to the right solution, what I actually like to do was I like to go back and think about how I could have improved my solution to make it easier to read or like easier to debug. So not code cleanliness is not only good in terms of, yeah. So code cleanliness is not only just, I think, something that you're getting evaluated for. Ideally, it's something that will help you better debug your code. I think writing helper functions in general is good practice, and it also makes for debugging easier because you can incrementally test like helper functions. You can also just, I think, have a better time trying to implement your own code when you separate out different parts of the logic into different helper functions as well. So those are just general tips. I don't think you should, I think for the language you're comfortable in, just read up on what the best coding practices are. Like there's very like Python specific naming conventions. There's also like Java specific naming conventions. So for whatever language you're comfortable in, there's like a ton of different resources online for that. Yeah, so someone says like, if you're using Python, for example, which is also the language I'm familiar with, they have something like Pep8 that you can read, and that kind of tells you what the best coding practices are. So just get like a general understanding of what like the proper naming conventions are. Don't try to remember every single detail. I think it's just in general, what are like the general high level ideas. Cool. So we don't really have a ton of time for the rest of this class. So if you have any other questions, feel free to ask me after class and I'll just go through and answer them. So I created these slides. I didn't realize that the panel would kind of run slightly over time, but so instead of 45 minutes, we kind of have 30 minutes to work through basically. So with 30 minutes, it seems realistically, you'll probably only have the opportunity to work on one question. So right here, if you go to the session 2 tab, which I linked directly to, I think what I'll have happen is I'll have people break out into groups of 2 to 3 and pick someone who will share their screen and kind of maybe do more of the coding. But as a group, I want you guys to come up with a solution for this first problem right here, which is evaluate reverse Polish notation. I think with 30 minutes, this will probably take most of the time. And if you have time, maybe take a look at the second problem. And if you don't have time to look at the second problem in class, look at it after class. So yeah, for each question, we'll have groups of 2 to 3 people. There's the first problem right there. Definitely finish implementing and testing a solution for this problem. And for the second problem, if you have time, just try tackling the pseudocode for it. Some feedback I've gotten from the TAs is even before jumping into implementation, when you already have pseudocode out for a solution for the problem we're doing, try to at least do some space and time complexity analysis before implementation so that you've had that discussion. Yeah. And in general, for expectations, when a TA pops into the room, we expect that there's an ongoing conversation. There should be pseudocode out. There should be some example inputs and outputs that you've run through, and share your screen so that we can easily jump in and help. And don't look at the solution during the interview. I know these are leak code problems, so the solutions are there, but don't look at it until you've fully implemented it and tested it. And don't utilize leak code to test your code. So don't do this because this is just not how it works in the real world. And it doesn't really do you a service to be reliant on leak code to test your code. So if you have any questions, Zoom has this raise your hand feature. So if you were to raise your hand, one of the TAs will get pinged and one of them will kind of jump in and help out. All right, so for the next 30 minutes, we'll have Elena break everyone out into groups of 2 to 3.
Sure. The rooms are now open.
All right. Everyone to come back into the rooms. Okay. All right, so I'll kind of wrap things up really quickly. So if you ever have problems with your rooms, feel free to come back into the main room. I think initially when everyone is breaking out into a room, give it like a minute or two for everyone to accept their invitations, because sometimes if you're the only one in the room, it might just be that someone else hasn't accepted that invitation yet. So just give it like a minute or two to do that, and then come back into the main room if there are any issues. So just a few callouts. I was able to jump into some of the rooms. I think I really liked the conversation that was happening there. The one thing is a lot of people, it wasn't that they were using leak code to test their code, it was that they were implementing everything in kind of like the leak code console. I would just recommend using, I always have a link here to like a new code interview session. So I just recommend using that instead, because that's just more of what happens when you actually do phone screens. It's a code interview like setup, and I think it's actually just a bit easier to debug and everything using this code interview environment. So definitely recommend that. For those of you who weren't able to finish this question, I think this question is really great in that it kind of like the overall implementation is very similar to a lot of like different parsing questions that you'll probably get more exposure to later on, and it's like pretty common as well. So definitely go through and try to implement that. I actually will post, so I'll post up solutions for these, or so with the evaluate reverse Polish notion one, I wrote up a guide for it. Trapping rainwater one, try to do the problem first, but leak code also has like a very good guide on it. So do that if you want more practice. I think these two questions are really good as well. So aside from that, it's just the usual. There's a HackerRank due this week. Next week, we'll kind of go back into learning and kind of reviewing new content instead of it being a review week. So make sure you go through the resources there for week 4. So there's, as always, for the weeks where we're actually introducing new content, there's generally like a guide that we'll write up. There's also a video introduction that might be really helpful, good refresher there. So spend some time, go through these before the next class. And that's all. So for the rest of the class, I'll just be answering any questions people might have. Cool. So does anyone have any questions? I'll just be reading through the Zoom group chat to answer maybe any questions people might have. Awesome. I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed the panel, and we'll try to get some more of those in. Okay, a lot of questions came in at one time. Yeah, for any of those who want me to review their resume, feel free to message me your resume over Slack. So in general, you should kind of have it in like PDF form, so that I think that's just generally the way you should be submitting your resumes anyway. So give those to me. I'll try to get back as soon as possible. It kind of just depends on how many requests I'm getting in to look over and get advice about, but I'll definitely take a look. In regards to the GPA, I'm not familiar with how Google filters in terms of like GPA. So from my experience, at least at Pinterest, like I haven't really heard people talk about GPA. Like we don't really talk about how someone is ineligible because they have a low GPA. So in general, like if you made it to the interview stage, I think at that point we're just seeing how you perform in your interview, and we like to talk to you about your projects. So some people are saying that when you apply to big tech companies, they don't really reach you. I think, so just to give you some context, I didn't start doing computer science until like my sophomore year of college. And when I was getting my first internship, that was really challenging. So I applied to a ton of these big companies and it was really hard. So if it's like the first internship you're doing, when I was in terms of like recruiting myself for my first internship, I actually just applied to a lot of different companies. So just, I think getting your foot in the door is more important, like having a tech internship. It can be from anywhere. I think once you have one internship down, it becomes, it becomes a bit easier to recruit with big companies. So I think when you have no experiences in engineering in general, it's quite challenging and they won't pick up your resume. But then once you have an internship where you've worked at a smaller company or you have some more work experience, that's generally pretty good. So someone says like, yeah, so it's not that GPA is irrelevant. It's that if you have a low GPA right now, there are other, like that is not the end all of your career, right? So great, if you have a good GPA, that it's not like we don't look at, so I don't want to say that like you get a good GPA and it's meaningless. It's more just that if you have a bad GPA right now, there are other ways to help with that, right? So a good way, I think what they talked about in terms of connections is really great. So in the past, I used to do hackathons and I was able to talk to a lot of people by doing hackathons. Getting involved in your CS community at your school is also really good because that kind of opens the doors in terms of talking to recruiters at different companies. So aside from that, if you have any friends at these companies, they can kind of ask you you can ask them for a referral. So like if you feel like your GPA is holding you back, there are all these other different methods to kind of get access or get your foot in the door. I think hackathons are pretty great if you have like interesting hackathon projects. I know when I had hackathon projects on my resume, people really like talking about that. Yeah, I think that kind of just makes you stand out more too. But yeah, exactly. As the TA was saying, like, I think the further along you are in your career, the kind of less the GPA matters. Like they kind of just care about your work experience and stuff like that. Yeah. I think at the end of the day, in regards to school, like optimize for learning. Like we say that a lot, but honestly, that's what truly matters. Like maybe a good GPA will get you your first job. At the end of the day, it's like how you perform at your job is ultimately going to matter more. And then like as you go on later in your career, that's kind of just what matters more as well. Like, are you learning from the different jobs you're having, the different internships? Like striving for that is, I think, more important. Sorry, I'm like trying to look at all the questions that was asking. Oh, so someone says if they interview with a software engineering position, can you still interview for a different position such as cybersecurity? I think for new grads, they kind of generally come in a general pool, so we'll just accept you as a generalist. I think in general, at least within Pinterest, I think if they feel like in an initial screen, you're not interviewing for a role that is a good fit for what we're looking for, they might pivot you to the right job opening. So you probably won't go through the full funnel. So generally what I've seen happen is we'll do a phone screen with someone and we'll say like, hey, I don't actually think that this job title is the right fit for them. They're really qualified, but maybe this other role is a potentially a better fit. So the recruiter will try to work with you to ensure that you're applying for the right fit before you even go through the full-time interview. So that's just generally been my experience. Someone says, do you have a strategy to get the most out of LeetCode? Yeah, for LeetCode, I think it's just a very good pool of questions. So generally, I think the advice that people generally give is that most of the questions you'll be given in a real world setting will be probably LeetCode medium style questions. And generally with LeetCode medium style questions, it's kind of expected that you can maybe try to get to a solution in around like the 30 to 35-minute ballpark. So sometimes companies will do LeetCode hard questions, but it's generally more common to do LeetCode medium. And with tackling LeetCode problems, I think a good strategy is maybe give yourself like a cutoff time. So if I'm spending more than like an hour on this problem, maybe at the end of the day, like either give yourself some cool off time where you stop working on that problem, or if you really feel like you can't make progress, look at the solution. So don't just spend like an infinite amount of time on one problem if you're stuck. Sometimes you kind of have to move on. So yeah, I think it's really easy to get really caught up in being stuck on one problem. And that tends to happen. So the other thing is when you read a solution, I think return back to that problem and try to implement that within like a week, or like give yourself some time and try to see if you can actually implement the solution you've just read. Cool. So I think the last question is, someone is saying, what do you do when you spend time explaining and coding a wrong solution, but at the moment feels like the correct solution? So I think I talked about this really briefly. So if you're, okay, so in a real interview type setting, the interviewer themselves will actually know the solution. I know when you're doing problems like in a kind of like pair programming type setting, it's like both of you are trying to work towards a solution. So when you're actually in an interview, I think when you come up with, if you're explaining, so first of all, explain your approach. Like don't even jump into coding until you explain your approach and try to get some validation from your interviewer. So explain your approach and say, hey, this is my approach, just generally, it's this runtime and this like space complexity. Should I kind of like go into implementation, or like, should I kind of like try to optimize my solution before even going into coding, right? So ask for feedback early and often when you're in an interview. And then, yeah, I think the feedback you're getting is like design your test cases like for your solution, right? So think of like the test cases for your given current implementation and see if like your implementation will work with these test cases. I think a lot of times people will just rely on the test cases they're given, and you fall in the trap of like, well, your code will only work with like very engineered or like very specific test cases because you haven't spent the time to come up with more test cases. So that's the other thing. Run test cases against your approach and validate that it kind of works, and come up with a few test cases to ensure that it will work. Yeah, so that's my advice. So the advice is ask for feedback from your interviewer. Don't jump into coding unless you've gotten positive feedback. The other thing is to think about all the different test cases. Try to come up with more than just the test cases you're given to try and see and validate if your solution works. So if you're given like, if they give you like 1 or 2 test cases, come up with your own 1 or 2 test cases that might test a different type of input. And just even before jumping into coding, like run through your code and make sure that it will handle all these cases you've come up with in addition to the cases they've given you. I think people the trap people fall into is they'll come up with very, very easy input and output, and that really doesn't do much. So it's beneficial for you to spend some upfront time investing into coming up with a slightly more complex test case that you think will better kind of hit the implementation or like the plan you've come up with. Yeah, so it seems like there's like a Stanford class that does a really good job of analysis of an algorithm and how to prove or disprove it. If you want, I can ask the TA for that link, and maybe that's also a good resource to dive into. Personally, I haven't looked into that, but yeah. Cool. It looks like he's looking for it, so I'll also like post up a link to that as well. So someone asks, where can we find more information about the virtual career fair at the end of the course? So with questions for the resume part of the career fair and the actual virtual career fair, can you guys post those to actually the general like SE103 June 2019? So there's actually someone else who's organizing the event, and they kind of have more like up-to-date answers about the logistics of the career fair and whether or not you can update your resume. So ask there. Actually, a lot of people ask questions about the virtual career fair. So in general, like, I think that's probably where you'll get the most up-to-date answers. Awesome. Okay, so I'm not teaching next week, but I'll be back on week 5, I believe. So I'll see you guys then. In the meantime, some people have sent me their resumes, and I'll try to get through them as quickly as possible. So yeah, feel free to if you have any questions, ping me on Slack. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Iris.
No problem.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.